You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
Welcome to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. This is where we make investing as simple as possible. It seems that every week I get more and more excited about the opportunity to interview different guests. And today we have Bylund, who I'll let him introduce himself. But first and foremost, he's written a book called How to Think About the Economy, a primer. And I love some people call it a primer, but I love this idea of a beginning. A primer is where you begin. It's where you start. And we're gonna speak a little bit about this book. But Professor Bylund, his credentials to read his CV would take an hour for sure. So I'm going to let him introduce himself just a little bit. But first of all, thank you, Professor Bylund, for being on the program.
Well, thanks for having me. It's going to be fun talking to you.
What made you want to become a professor of economics?
Well, that's actually a long story. I started out not in academia at all, but it was actually my wife who once told me in my previous career that I was miserable doing what I was doing, and I was in tech doing systems development and business consulting during the dot-com bubble and that sort of thing. And since I was reading and writing anyway and was studying on the side, she told me that, why don't you go into academia? And I told her she was crazy. And then a week after, pretty much, I apologized and said that she was right, as wives usually are. and then after that, I applied for grad school, and I ended up in an applied economics program.
And now you're at the Oklahoma State University, and you've written a marvelous book. And generally, I never hesitate to endorse the books. If I didn't think it was good, I wouldn't invite the guest on. But I'm going to start with a blatant commercial right now. Go to Amazon.com and purchase right now How to Think About the Economy, a primer. And I'll tell you why. First of all, I tell my sons that capitalism is about inequality. And it's not the type of inequality most people think. What capitalism is when you offer more than you take. When you have a value that is so large that people are willing to trade their money because they get the better part of the deal. And, if my sons say, well, Dad, how am I ever going to get ahead if I always give more than I take? I go, well, you'll serve more people. And I just look at, just your pricing alone on this book tells me that you can tell me if I'm wrong, but you're really interested in educating people about this. Because this book is one of the most inexpensive books. This is a labor of love and mission driven, because this is a fantastic book and it's incredible value. Am I close on that assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's $8 on Amazon, but you can get it from the Mises store, that's the publisher of the book, for $5. And they actually posted the book for free, so anyone can download it. Both the PDF, the EPUB, and the audio version.
Yeah, the Kindle was I think the Kindle was $2, and I think the audio was like $4, and I love to listen. So buy this book is what I'm starting with. And with that, let's hop into a little bit about the economy. So, you talk about two theories out there. One, I've heard, and I've also listened to some of your speeches. One, you say, well, we have, production, and we have consumption, we have scarcity, we have some limited resources. We're going to try and serve other people. An entrepreneur is a speculative idea where I say, hey, not only maybe can I produce some things for myself, but maybe I can serve others and produce some things others would like. And then you've got another theory that, hey, there's unlimited resources and money grows on trees, basically. Could you comment on, that's quite a contrast in theory. And I don't know how you have a job at a university thinking you have a lot of common sense in what you have to say. So I do not know how you became a professor at a university, because you have a lot of common sense. Very rare. In fact, I think you've almost said, if you want to learn about the economy, some economics courses are just not the place to go. So that's kind of a long, drawn out question, but could you talk about the contrast of the dogma of money growing on trees and as opposed to real production.
Right, and that actually strikes at the core of why I thought this book was necessary, because economics is really built around that things are scarce, meaning not that there are very few of things, but that we can find more valuable uses of whatever there is. So
right.
all the resources that we have, if we had enough for everything that we wanted to produce, then we wouldn't consider them goods or resources at all. We would just take them for granted, just much like the air we breathe. It's not like we economize on every breath because there's enough air. So we need it still, but it's not a scarce resource. And economics was always the study of how we use scarce resources and how they come to be used towards satisfying people's ends and making people better off. And it is really the study of scarcity in that sense. But there's always been different critics of this idea, because the problem with recognizing that the world is scarce and all resources are scarce is that you can't do everything you want. Mm-hmm. And there is a cost to everything. So if you choose to use this resource to do whatever action A, that means that you can't use that same resource to do action B because you chose A instead. So there's always this trade-off. This, of course, doesn't fit politics and doesn't fit with some people's ideological view of what the world should be like.
Right.
So they want to get rid of poverty thinking, or maybe it's wishful thinking. I'm not sure where they come from, but they want to think that poverty is created or it's a policy choice, and you hear those kind of political slogans saying that all we need to do is just take property away from people, because then there will be enough for everyone. Of course, that's ridiculous, but people tend to fall for that idea. And if you offer people a lot of money and wealth, why wouldn't they take it?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense that they wouldn't. So we have all these. I would even go so far as calling them false prophets, because it's a worldview that doesn't fit the world at all. The world doesn't work like that. And so it's very destructive to have those types of ideas, and especially try to change the world based off of those ideas, because that's sort of denying reality.
You know, it is such, this is such an important book that you've written, and it's such an important time for people to read it and to tell their friends about it. What I think is interesting is there's always, we can talk about Keynesian economics or Austrian economics or different types of theories, but really what I love about your book, it would do wonders for an electorate to begin to learn these things. And I guess this is a really good time for a conversation, because we have this debt ceiling debate in Washington. But I'm not sure that a lot of people understand that debate, because this is silly in my view, because we've raised the debt ceiling 100 times. We're going to continue because we have promises that feel good to people. Hey, they're human rights, right? It's a God-given right to have this and have that, and there's certain levels of dignity that everyone should have. And these things these are not ideas I wouldn't support. They feel good, but the practicality is getting tougher and tougher. $188 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And I don't know that people understand from, on the fiscal side of things, that a debt ceiling we've hit of 30 trillion, and change, is just the beginning of saying, look, we're monetizing that debt by saying, hey, we'll sell bonds to pay for our immediate bills. We've got 188 trillion to go that we've committed to in healthcare and pensions and people who will be medical dependents and pensioners in the United States. Any thoughts on why do politicians get away with this? Is it because of a lack of financial education in the electorate?
Well, I think that's a big part of it. And that's also part of why I thought that writing this book was so important, that if people could, and then I think they can, it's just that they haven't really encountered the ideas or being told about or educated in these ideas in the right way. And that's probably why they don't see through these sort of things, because politicians, they promise a lot of things, and their only job really, or their first job, their first priority is to get elected and then reelected.
Yep.
And that means that the longest time horizon they have is typically 4 years, whereas the world is going to go on for generations and generations. And we make our choices based off of what we want to produce and what lives we want to lead until we die, which might be decades or maybe even a century, and also including our children. So if we have children or grandchildren, then we have a greater time horizon than 4 years necessarily. But if someone is claiming that they can provide us with something that we don't have, and that they can do it for free, as they call it, right? Then of course people are going to fall for that idea, not thinking about who might pay it, or simply assuming that, well, just tax the rich or something like that, thinking that the rich are so rich that they can be taxed just a little bit, and that will take care of everything for everyone. Which, of course, also is ridiculous, because the rich are not rich enough, and there are not enough rich people to actually pay for all these things. They don't have those, what did you say, $188 trillion. There's no one that rich that can be taxed that amount, and there's no one rich enough to be taxed the $30 trillion of deficit every year either. So and of course, if you tax capital and tax profits enough, then people don't have an incentive to work for profits either. So we're going to have less of it if we tax more of it. So there are a lot of ways that you can avoid thinking in the wrong way about these things, which means you're not going to be fooled. And you can make the world so much more rational and reasonable if you have the right kind of thinking. And that was the purpose of the book, to bring this kind of thinking to regular people, not just folks within the ivory tower like myself, but real people. I mean, when I wrote it, I wrote it thinking the target audience would be someone's grandma.
Yeah.
So if you're discussing, say, a Thanksgiving dinner or something like that, and you talk about economics, and your grandma is there, and she's like, what are you talking about these ideas? Where do you get these ideas? Where can I learn more? Then you should be able to not only afford to buy the book, but you should be able to just hand it to her and say, Grandma, read this. And it will take her an afternoon, nothing more. And it should be easy enough for her to understand it. And that would change the world, I think, if people would do that.
You have a real gift of simplicity, which I just love. You made a comment in a speech I was watching you say, things like this. Gee, if I want to eat some bread and consume it, it has to be baked first. That's called the order of production and consumption. And I think to myself, well, that's pretty simple. I would think Janet Yellen would be able to grasp that, and politicians would be able to grasp, simple things like this. Could you speak to the demon? You talk about taxing the rich, and there's a debate on what a fair share is. But I think about it. You're a professor of entrepreneurship, and I think if you put me in my garage, and you said, Andy, build an iPhone, and don't come out until you've got an iPhone built or an iPad. I'd never leave that's so beyond my capability. And to produce 300 million of those and put them around the world, the fact a guy, got rich because we paid for those is not a sin. It's not a demonic thing that a guy like Steve Jobs became wealthy because he gave way more than he took to the world. And besides that, he says, hey, you can have your share of this. My wife and I own shares of Apple. So even though I don't know how to produce an iPhone myself, he's going to take his company public. He's going to let me actually share in the profits. Like literally they're called shares of stock. And I get paid every quarter for the work that he did and the work that they are doing, even though I don't know how to build an iPhone. What's wrong with simply teaching children to buy companies and use compounding? You don't need that big of a rate of return if you start in your teens to become very wealthy in your life. Any thoughts on entrepreneurship, having taught it? How do your students respond to these types of ideas in the culture that they get in all of the other classes they attend?
Well, I think you put it well before when you said that it's so intuitive these ideas, and I think they are, and that's how my students respond too. I mean, if you just tell them what is actually going on, it is pretty obvious. It's just that usually you don't think about them in those terms, and instead you think about the whole economy. It's a complex place, and you're bombarded with the statistics. You mentioned the deficits and those debates, and everything is sort of presented in black and white, but no one is actually talking about the process and what is underlying the whole thing. I mean, entrepreneurship, to understand it's really simple. I mean, what an entrepreneur does is they have a vision of producing some good or service. They bring it to the market and they try to sell it. And that's when they realize whether it actually has enough value for someone to buy it or not.
Yeah.
And that value is not decided by them. The entrepreneur does not decide whether this is worth it to you to buy it. They have to figure out how to produce a product, whatever it is, that you value, and that you value more than the price you're paying, because otherwise you wouldn't pay it. You would only pay it if you think that, oh, this is actually worth my money and the money you earned through hard labor or whatever it might be. That's when you buy it. And you will buy it again if it actually satisfies whatever ends you have and whatever goals you have with the product. The role for the entrepreneur is not only to figure out how to serve people in this sense, but also how to choose the correct costs and keep them low enough to make a profit. Of course, the lower price they can sell the product at, the more they can sell, but that also means that they need to keep the costs lower.
Yeah.
So the way I put it is that entrepreneurs, their main task is not to create value, as we usually say, because that's not really what they're doing. It is to choose the correct costs for the good that they envision that consumers will be satisfied with. And they have to choose the really low cost to make a good profit.
Yeah, well, competition is deflationary by nature. If I were to list on the board, it would be interesting exercise to list on a chalkboard in a classroom everything an iPhone can do right now. Like everything it could do for me right now. And then go back to 1980 and see how much it would cost me to do those exact same things, some of which would not be able to be done, incidentally. And the fact you can buy one of these for $1,000 to buy the same thing in 1980, are you kidding me? It's deflationary by nature. Technology and advancement.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes to the problem with looking at statistics, as we usually do as well. Because it's exactly right what you say, that the market itself and innovation and entrepreneurship and competition, what those do is lower prices.
Yep.
So we should get more and more for our hard-earned dollars.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of things. And everybody realizes this if they look at, well, what are companies doing? Well, they're trying to undercut each other in price and higher quality, and they're trying to cut costs. Everybody knows that.
Sure.
So, of course, prices should fall. Well, then we look at the inflation statistics, and the inflation is a measure of how higher the prices are today than last year. Well, the prices shouldn't be the same as last year. They should be lower. So the inflation rate is actually much higher than the statistics show.
Right.
But you can't really understand this unless you think of what should the economy really be like? What makes sense if you think of the entrepreneurship and production and competition that is sort of core to the marketplace?
There's an interesting detachment that seems to come from fundamentals in the stock market, in all the financial markets. When we produce the amount of cash that we produce, and the idea that, well, if we fill people with enough cash, then they'll draw production out, right? We'll give them enough. If you give people money to spend, then people will produce things for them to spend their money on, which is kind of the opposite idea of producing some bread and then eating it. Give a guy a bunch of money and he'll eat more bread, I guess, or he'll order, extra bread. I don't know. But can you talk a little bit about MMT? One of the guys I follow on Twitter that I've followed a long time, I've asked him to come on the podcast like 20 times, and he does not want to talk with me. It's a guy named Warren Mosler, and he was a bond trader, and he wrote a white paper a long time ago about modern monetary theory, which I don't know if it's really that new of a theory. Could you talk a little bit about MMT and where in your daily life, how often do you encounter people that are embracing this idea? Because I think it's a dangerous idea. Is that idea growing or is it being quashed?
Well, it depends on where you look. I think, unfortunately, I think it's growing like by a lot among people in general and in politics. Mm-hmm. But it has basically no place at all in sort of professional or academic economics, because economists don't really take them seriously, mm-hmm. and for good reason. But in a sense, the problem with that idea is that it's not wrong in some parts, but then they sort of take those ideas and they extrapolate them forever. Yeah. I mean, the way they describe the monetary system, the way it currently is, it's true what they say, that the government can never run out of dollars. Yeah, of course, the government creates dollars, so they can just create as many as they like, and we've seen that they do that or through the Federal Reserve and the banking system and whatnot, but still, it's the government's dollars.
Right.
The problem with that is that if you extrapolate that idea and say that, oh, well, that means the government can never run out of resources. Well, that's a very different idea.
Very different.
And the dollars are not going to buy as much if you start producing trillions and trillions of more dollars every year. They're not going to be able to buy a lot, and eventually they're not going to be able to buy anything at all, because why would anyone want to accept those dollars that basically grow on trees suddenly and sell your resources, real stuff, machines and cars and food, for those things that they just produce endlessly? No one would want to do that. And that would be, if we hit something like hyperinflation at some point. And
right.
Many countries have experienced that throughout history. But their idea is that the government not only can, but should produce a lot of dollars and then spend those in the economy. And they prop this up with a lot of sort of deepities. Their idea is that, well, there are so many resources that are idle and not used in production. So if the government goes in and basically spends a lot of dollars, then more resources are going to be put to use, and therefore we can increase economic growth. But this is sort of turning your back on all of economics that has been developed for 300 years, and they don't have really a conception at all about the real economy, the mm-hmm. economy of things and people and things like that. They completely skip over that part and think that you can get a lot of stuff for free if you just have enough dollars.
Yeah, as you look at production, one of the largest numbers in macroeconomics is gross domestic product. You know, what are we producing? And when I look at our government, and the numbers from 2022 are staggering. Over half the money that the government spent was just to people for either medical issues, pensions, benefits, veteran benefits. Almost $700 billion in interest now. And so well over half goes to those, basically entitlements and interest. And about 40% of it goes to other stuff like defense and education and, transportation, stuff like that. So when you're giving money, you're taxing and you're giving that amount of money just to pay for medical bills and to pay for Social Security and what they call income security now, which I don't even understand how that got slipped in since COVID. But that's a tremendous amount of money to promise people and to continue to grow on a GDP of 30 trillion. Because all you can do is tax the 30 trillion. That's it. You got to take some of that 30 trillion and take a bunch out of it and run your government that way. So you mentioned hyperinflation, and I never really bought into, we're going to be Zimbabwe, or we're going to be Venezuela, or we're going to be the Weimar Republic. But man, the more I look at it since COVID and the amount of money we've printed, to me, maybe you could give some insight on this. To me, it's almost like a dam that breaks. You got you spring a leak here and there's time to patch it. And there's spring a leak here and there's time to patch it. But there's a point where you sort of lose control of it and it hyperinflates. Is that a poor analogy? And do you feel we're close to that? Or is it just a bunch of people crying wolf?
No, I think the analogy is sound. I mean, the problem is that what makes a money, and the reason people accept money in exchange, and the reason they work for money and things like that, is that we expect other people to accept it in return.
Yeah.
So I would never get paid in dollars unless I also thought that others would get paid in dollars.
Confidence.
So they would be worthless to me, right, if I didn't think that I would be able to use them. And this, of course, means that as long as people expect others to use it, well, if there's inflation of 5 or 10 or 20% perhaps, and, well, other people are going to use the money, so I'm going to stick with using dollars anyway. And, of course, there are laws requiring that I have dollars in my account and whatever else. So that also...
The modern monetary theorists would say your taxes are paying dollars, so that's going to create demand for dollars because they don't accept Bitcoin for taxes, right? That's what the MMT guys would say.
Yeah, that's what they say. And I actually have a forthcoming paper on that because their argument is fundamentally flawed for several reasons. But the issue with, the dam breaking is that, there are the cracks would be such things as inflation when it goes up a little bit and things like that. But it's when people start to think that maybe I shouldn't accept dollars, or maybe I'm not sure whether people will accept dollars when I go to the grocery store or when I buy things online or whatever else. When people start turning their backs on the currency, well, then you're already in the hyperinflation problem, because then people are trying to get rid of the currency rather than try to get the currency. Yeah. And at that point, it's the trust in the money, right? Yeah. So when people lose that trust, and they all do it, if I do it only personally, it's not going to have much of an effect on the economy. But when people start to do that, you can't really stop it. I don't think there was ever a country where the leadership said, you know what, we're going to cause hyperinflation. Of course not. They were trying to avoid it, if anything, or maybe they didn't understand it. So they were spending, and then suddenly they were in this mess, and everything was just going down the tubes, and they couldn't stop it because there was no trust in the money anymore. So hyperinflation is not really a choice when you get to that point, right? You can push the boundaries and push, and then eventually you're going to be there in the middle of the storm. But you might not recognize it until you're taking that last step into it, and then it might be too late to turn back.
Here's a question. I don't know. I hope the listeners find this interesting. I hope they're asking the same question. When I interview PhDs, and I'm lucky because I could never get into the business school at Oklahoma State. My grades weren't good enough, man. I was a basketball player, man. I couldn't jump, I couldn't shoot, I could foul. That was it. So that's how I got through college was playing hoops. And it wasn't until later in my life that I became a real student of this stuff. I really screwed up, should have listened, should have worked harder when I was young. If someone reads your book, there's two ways you could think about this. We get everyone educated, and there's a systemic change. You get a whole bunch of people that realize, wow, we have some very, very, very foolish and silly fiscal policies from government. It's beyond breathtaking. It'll take your breath away when you look at the numbers. We say, all right, we fixed this systemically. My feeling is that ship has sailed. My feeling is there's no chance for that. I think about what's happening in the debate right now, they're saber rattling and using, the tragedy of default as levers, as political leverage to fight. And that doesn't even, remotely solve this problem, because we're going to be right back in the same discussion every year. We're going to have to raise the debt ceiling every year. We're going to deal with this as an electric every year, and it's going to get worse. The other way we could look at your book is a person, and this is the view I take, I'm curious to see what your view is look, the reason you learn economics is maybe not because we need an electorate to change things systemically, but you need to prepare individually at the family level, at the household level, maybe a small community level, that an understanding of this can help you prepare and understand better what is coming. What's your take? Are you hoping for a systemic change, or are you saying, hey guys, that ship might have been sailed, but you ought to learn about it so you can help yourselves?
Well, I think my position is a little bit on something in between the two. I mean, I agree with you that changing politics, there's no one in politics that has any incentive to do
No
different.
way. You hit it on the head.
I mean,
it's votes. You hit it on the head. All they care about is votes.
Yeah, and as soon as they're elected, there's a ton of money with investments and whatever else. I mean, insider trading is not a crime if you're a congressman, right? So I don't think we're going to have that effect. But of course, if people en masse start to make demands of changing behavior, then of course they're going to be able to get votes by changing their behavior, perhaps. But I think that the book really speaks to the power of entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurship can change the world. And I usually say that there are two things you need to know in order to be a good entrepreneur and sort of, in a sense, maximize your chances of making real change in the world and making a bunch of money. And one is to understand the economy, because otherwise you can't position your business correctly. You can't figure out what to expect. You can't make any predictions whatsoever, and you have basically no clue. You're trying to do it blind, and that means you're depending on luck, that's not a good idea if you're investing your own money. And the other is to understand people. You have to be able to empathize with your customers and see what problems people are experiencing, whether or not people actually understand those problems. We might not see it as a problem. We didn't see it as a problem that we didn't have smartphones before the first iPhone. But still, the smartphone solved a big problem for us because now we're so much better off. So those two things are important. And I think entrepreneurship is what really changes the world. I mean, a good example of that is Uber. Yeah. Most people don't even remember how terrible it was to get a cab and how nasty the cars were and expensive, and the drivers weren't nice or friendly, and they didn't care much about you. And whether you waited 45 minutes or a couple of hours, well, they didn't care. And right? And today, taxi companies, they can't compete if they are as bad as they used to be, because Uber created a different type of service, and they basically sidestepped the regulations that were in place to protect cab companies.
Yeah.
So very often the cities have like a committee or something like that, or a council that regulates the industry, and it's usually the incumbents that are on this committee. So you have the existing taxi companies, they are represented on this committee, and they are voting on who to allow to start a business or expand and things like that, which of course it's a cartel, it's nothing else, right? And the law then supports the cartel, so you couldn't compete with them. You had to do business exactly the way they were doing business. And if you're starting a new company, you can't undercut existing companies just on cost. It's impossible. So what Uber did was simply say, well, we're not a taxi company, and we're going to do this differently and offer a different type of service, so we don't suffer from the same regulations. We don't have to do it that way. We can do it in a different way. And of course, that completely disrupted that industry. And we've seen this over and over again throughout history, that this is what entrepreneurs do. And they even changed the legal framework because policymakers needed to make changes to allow for and regulate Uber, and therefore they also had to deregulate the taxi business because they were suffering from the regulations that previously protected them. So I think entrepreneurship, if you understand it correctly, and I think you will if you read this book and if you think about it logically and rationally, then you can change the world and at the same time provide for your family. So in that sense, I think it's a little bit in between. It's not changing the electorate completely, and it's not only protecting yourself personally, but you can actually change the world through starting a business and running changes and causing change in the world through business, through entrepreneurship.
You know, and when I speak about, changing the electorate, I've worked very, very hard in my life to remain politically neutral. I have friends that are heavy to the right, friends that are heavy to the left. I figure that they'll work harder to earn my vote if I don't give it away in advance. And I think there's sins that are grievous on the right and the left, particularly in the extremities of both parties. One of the things I hate is conspiracy theory, because the the psychology of the human brain, we're built to buy into, conspiracy theories that we won't go into the psychology of that. But here's one that I fear about illiteracy is, are there powers that be that would be threatened? I think the answer is yes, if we got smart economically. I mean, if it were civic duty, right? If it were civic duty to understand the economy, to understand fiscal policy, to understand monetary policy, boy, that might change things. Is there a reason that these are not prominent courses in school? Is there a reason for that? Or is it just because we don't teach it? I mean, why is it that a person can graduate from high school and they can have a basic understanding of executive branch and legislative branch and judicial branch, and they can have maybe a whatever version of history they teach now of American history, and they have a pretty good, I think, pretty good idea of reading, writing, arithmetic, but they can go in a voting booth at 18 after high school's over and know nothing about monetary policy, know nothing about gross domestic products, know nothing about fiscal policy. Why is that? Why is that not a priority in our schools?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think there is a conspiracy keeping sound economic thinking from people. But you're right that some interests would definitely have a harder time if people understood economics. So in that sense, educating yourself simply means that you're not going to be taken advantage of as much as you otherwise might be.
Yeah.
I think, in terms of learning this stuff, I think...
I guess the reason I ask the question is I don't believe in Bigfoot, and I don't believe in aliens, and I don't believe in, most of that type of stuff. But it is so conspicuously absent to me. Like how in the world can you go in the voting booth and not understand fiscal and monetary? If you went, remember Jay Leno used to go jaywalking and ask people questions, they give stupid answers, we'd laugh. But if you went jaywalking and we just went to the mall together and we said, tell me what you know about Jerome Powell and monetary policy. What do you know about that? I think we draw blank stares most of the time. It's so conspicuously absent.
Yeah, it is. There's very little understanding about the economy overall, which of course is why I wrote the book.
Yep.
And I'm very troubled by it. And I get this all the time from my students too. I mean, in a sense, I have to re-educate them when they take my courses.
Yeah.
Because the little they know, it's really strange. Mm-hmm. And I think in a sense, part of it is the failure of economics, because economics has turned away from being sort of a philosophy about the economy to instead be a tool for policymakers to make predictions and calculate the outcomes, which of course then immediately gets turned into how can we justify these policies using numbers and data.
Right.
So economists in some sense are sort of the statisticians of the polity, I suppose. But it's also an ideological thing, and I think we all want to be able to get things for free. We want to find these simple, quick fixes, and we want to believe that they actually work.
Yeah.
And of course, we don't want to put in a lot of effort or work really hard or things like that if we don't have to.
Yep.
So that's why there are plenty of theories about how we can actually, much like MMT, as you mentioned before, thinking that, well, we can get a lot of stuff for free if we just exploit the system with a fiat dollar and things like that. And those theories, of course, they get wings. People want to believe them, and it makes it really difficult to say something else and try to spread the word about how the economy actually works, because it's not a pretty picture.
It's interesting, the importance of production and that four-letter word of work. There's always been, different types of alchemy, economic alchemy, or dreams of alchemy around. My guest has been Per Bylund. He is a professor. He teaches associate professor at Oklahoma State University You can Google him and find all kinds of resources. But most important, go to Amazon.com today. Pick up a copy of How to Think About the Economy, a primer. And if you don't know much about economics, boy, do yourself a favor. Whether you can be a part of a, which would be ideal, a more systemic change towards a more educated, electorate and citizenry, or if you just say, you know what, if you're like in Andy Tanner's camp and say, hey, these problems are so large now, there's no political will ever that will save them. But boy, I'd sure like to know what I could do. To education is life, man. If and when we have big problems because of these economic policies, which I think we will. I don't know when it'll happen. I think knowing what to do or having an understanding what's going on is going to be life-saving. So I'll give you the last word. You've been gracious with your time. What would you, if you could give one message to listeners, someone thinking about entrepreneurship or thinking about learning more about investing, what would your counsel be?
Well, my counsel would be simply to think about it rationally. I mean, there's a logic to how people act. There's a logic to how the economy works, and just getting some information before you get started and listening to good advice is good advice. I think what I teach and what is taught in entrepreneurship is primarily how to avoid common problems and common errors that people make. So avoid errors. That's my advice.
Fabulous stuff. You've been listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. This is where we do our very best to make investing simple. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.